In this video, we're going to talk about trade and protectionism. For this example, we're going to use the United States and India purely because I have the two graphics available. This example can represent different countries in trading relationships. In a previous video, we noted how countries might choose to specialize. The United States, for example, might be more efficient producing vehicles. India might be more efficient producing food. Each country would specialize in what they're good at, what they can do more effectively and cheaper. Then they could trade the surplus, which would create a dynamic where everyone globally would be better off. However, not everyone would be better off. Farmers in the United States would be disadvantaged. Similarly, manufacturing workers in India would be out of a job. And so that might put pressure on domestic governments to do something about that. Protectionism are measures that governments can implement to try and reduce the impact of imports coming from abroad. Those trade barriers can come in a number of different forms, but general term that categorizes them is called protectionism. And we're going to look at some different examples of how protectionism works. Let's say we have a situation where domestic producers are at a disadvantage and the government wants to intervene to try and protect those industries. In the United States, let's say food production is $50. India can produce it more cheaply. They can produce it for $25 a unit. Naturally, those imports would be more attractive to American consumers because they would be cheaper. The American farmers can't compete. They cannot compete. They cannot produce units of food as cheaply as their counterparts overseas can. What happens here? Well, let's say the government decides it wants to protect American farmers. It could offer them a subsidy, which is a direct payment that they can use to help reduce the costs of production and reduce their market price. So a subsidy of, let's say, $30 would take their production costs down from $50 and their new price would be $20. That makes it cheaper than the imports coming from overseas. That's a trade barrier. That subsidy acts as a barrier to trade. It stops the foreign imports by making them less attractive to domestic consumers. There's another way that governments could approach protectionism. Let's look at the auto sector. Let's say American companies can produce automobiles for $50 a unit. Those in India, $75 a unit. The domestic producers in India cannot compete with the cheaper imports coming from the United States. The government in India might want to do something to protect domestic industries. They might choose to put a tax on imported vehicles coming from America. That tax is called a tariff. So if a tariff of $30 was applied to every single unit coming in from the United States, that new price would be $80, which would be more expensive than the domestically produced ones. That makes the domestic ones more attractive and acts as a barrier to trade that is keeping out the American imports. The tariff is acting as a barrier to trade. Governments might recognize that this is inefficient, and so they might agree to avoid protectionist measures. We call that free trade. When governments voluntarily agree to restrict protectionism, restrict the use of subsidies, quotas, or tariffs, anything that could restrict the flow of trade across borders. So just in summary, trade can be good as it can increase productivity and global output, but there can be negative distributional effects. People lose their jobs. Government can use protectionism to try and protect those jobs and reduce the competitive pressures from foreign imports. They can use tariffs, which applies a tax to the imports coming into the country, or they can use subsidies to subsidize domestic industries and make them more competitive. Obviously, this can protect workers. It can be good to protect domestic industries, but it can hurt consumers because it's restricting them from accessing foreign imports that might be cheaper. Free trade works to eliminate those barriers.